Thanks a lot, Bruno. It certainly raised a lot of questions in the audience that I'm going to try and field a little bit. And I will say people have used both the question and answer forum as well as the chat forum to start having discussions about this, this material. So I just want to remind the audience that we're probably not going to get through every single question on in the question and answer box in this part of the presentation, but we are uploading that whole set of questions to the eClass site, and we are, as presenters, we're going to go in and make sure that there are answers to each one of the questions addressed there. So Bruno, can I start with some questions that came up from a number of people? Right towards the end, 3 or 4 people were wondering how government infusions of cash into the economy are actually picked up in the model or could be included in the model, or are they included at this point in the model?
Yeah, so this is I'm kind of setting up a baseline economy. We could include that in the model, right? We could say that if there is an exogenous party like the government that has some pockets that is outside of this capital accumulation, right? And we can maybe make up for the loss of investments, right? That's one way that that could be included in this model. So if we could keep the economy going somehow, if the economy is not self-financing, maybe exogenous party would be able to self-finance in this model. That's definitely something that the governments around the world are trying to do with this package, right? To try to have a bigger role in the economy. In my model, the government has no role because I'm not modeling the government, right? But when you try to have a bigger role in the economy, you're trying to maintain economic activity high. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that one way to do this, if you want to include that here, would be is moving that process of decreasing investment.
Okay, thanks. The second question that came up from a number of people in slightly different ways was, how do we incorporate the fact that so many of us in various societies lost their jobs or were underemployed due to stay-at-home restrictions? Because we actually weren't sick. For some of us, we could work at home, yes, but for other people, there's no possibility of them being able to work at home. So how can we add that into the model to add that level of reality?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And again, we would need to break up this economy, because all we have in this simple model is one big economy, one big output, right? So you could try to break up this economy in different parts and see what happens if only one sector is affected and not the other sector. So it would be a improvement on this model, and then we can see how things change. It is possible to do that, but it's also a thing that is, we have to keep in mind, like, are we trying to learn? What are we trying to learn? Like, are we trying to learn how different pieces of the puzzle fit together, or are we really trying to develop a full model to explain what's going on out there? And I think that's very complex, and we really need a team of epidemiologists and economists, and I think this is going to happen, actually. I think that economists are going to be jumping over this and try to develop complex models that capture this flexibility, or what we are actually experiencing in the real world right now. Right, so I think the answer is possible. Models are going to come. They're going to become more and more sophisticated to go with other things. And I wouldn't be surprised if economists start to work really closely with epidemiologists, and we have like this group of interdisciplinary scholars writing papers and producing research on what's going on out there. There is also the applied side, right? The empirical side of this. So one thing is to kind of write a model and try to understand the mechanisms. The other thing is that we have a lot of data out there, and different economies experience the infection in different ways and have different sets of regulations, right? So maybe we can look at this as almost like as an experiment and see, wow, this country did this, and let's see what happened. This country did that, and maybe we can try to control. I think those kinds of papers are going to come in the years following this crisis. Yeah.
Okay, one last question, although I've got more for you, but I'll give some to Brent in a second. People were wondering, for people that were not in the workforce, but are clearly affected by the pandemic, and in some cases have had the way they've been affected have had huge ramifications for how the pandemic economic effects are rolled out. So people that are vulnerable, people that are older and retired, those people are not showing up in the model, but the fact that they have become sick and have had huge economic impacts. And so is that an important characteristic to include in the models?
Absolutely, right? So this is in a way what we call a supply side model, in a sense that if we have the resources, we're going to use it, and we can always produce, and there's always going to be a demand for it, right? We're not really modeling unemployment unless through the epidemic, but the baseline model doesn't capture other things. And again, it's just the idea, like I said in the presentation, is just to kind of show how scientists use these models and this idea of creating some baseline as a reference and see how things change as you're moving. The real world is much, much more complex, right? And of course, there are many things, like the millions of effects that can have a real impact on production even, right? So for instance, if you have an economy that is stressed because it's running through an epidemic too quickly, and there is like really bad things happening, there's emotional toll in the economy that definitely could have an impact on production and how the country is functioning, right? Now we're also not capturing that. Everything that is capturing this very, very simple model that I showed you is just all the changes are through employment. And again, we start with a model of full employment. So it's a model that is not really designed to answer those questions. But like I said, I think those are very, very important questions, and we need to start opening up these models and try to work together with other scholars and make big groups of people from different fields to learn about this, because I hope that we are better prepared the next time if something like this again happens. I wish we know more from the medical side. I wish we know more from the economic side,
right? Brent, I don't want to leave you out. At some point in your presentation, a number of people commented on the fact that you said primary producers, i.e. farmers in many countries, are the least affected. And people raised a question from a number of different geographies in the world, including a question related to livestock producers in Alberta. And people were interested in your perception or the research that shows that primary producers are the least affected yet or entirely from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, I saw lots of interest in that question. This is just you make a plug, I guess, for the modeling, the empirical modeling work that IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, is doing, and they're releasing early results from their work. So they're using country-level models and bringing in COVID-19 into their projections. So, and primarily I was referring to their results. What I understand is the service sector primarily being in the retail side. So most of the service sector jobs are in that end of the value chain. And then when we had the lockdowns, there was immediate shocks to all of those people. So as I said, 800,000 restaurant workers here in Canada were immediately affected. And I guess that because there's very little adjustment that they can do, with primary agriculture having a demand for it, right? The demand hasn't gone away for food. It's gone away for certain types of food. There's been, I think that we'll see a ripple, I guess, you know, thinking about this in the bigger picture now, as we get shocks, then those ripple through to the processing sector and to the primary sector. So if we have bottlenecks like we have with meat packing now in North America, that has an effect back to the primary producer. I think if IFPRI's models didn't have those type of bottleneck effects, which have been, I think, somewhat unpredictable of where some of those bottlenecks would occur and what effects those would have. So I guess it's a combination of the small number of, the smaller number of products that some sort of products that farmers are producing compared to the products that service workers are producing. So I think that it would be hard to find, a shock more larger than that shock on retail food in most of our societies. That has been a service sector effect. And I think, Ellen, you'll deal with this next week as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brent, for that. A couple of people also commented on the fact that you mentioned that some middle-income countries have had social welfare programs which have helped in the face of this pandemic. And they were wondering about some examples, either examples of what middle-income countries you might be discussing, or specifically what programs you thought might have been helpful in the pandemic.
Yeah, I find this has probably been the most exciting area, or one of the most exciting areas of development economics in the last 20 years or so, is that of how to deal with chronic poverty, and whether to try to kind of provide infrastructure or education or healthcare. And often one of the best things that can be done is actually to protect people against the effects of shocks. So social protection programs have really developed, and with a tremendous amount of positive impact assessments that have been made of these social protection programs, really to address chronic poverty. And those, because often you have people who are very poor and suffer a shock, and then they're kind of caught in a poverty trap, and sort of a downward cycle of poverty. The social protection done right can help to buffer those shocks and keep people from falling into deeper poverty. The International Labor Organization I referred to has a recent report about kind of the state of social protection programs in the context of COVID-19, and I think showing something like 74 of the 119 countries, as I recall, I don't have that in front of me, having social protection programs. So some of those can be things that are directed to seniors, for example, or to young mothers or mothers of young children. Those programs, when they're there, especially the modern programs which link direct cash payments into transfers, electronic transfers into people's bank accounts, those programs can be then kind of used quickly because people are already registered. We already have a way of getting money to them, and they can be used quickly. I think that's been a challenge for every country because they're overwhelmed by the need. Every country, maybe take as an example, like India has a food distribution program and has some social protection programs. Dealing with the size of the demand and the size of the need is overwhelming for many countries, but I think better than it would be without. So it does include places like Ethiopia, for example, has effective smaller programs, and then many of the Latin America countries from Mexico to Brazil have pretty large and pretty expensive programs, but they're there now when they're really needed. So I would refer people to the International Labor Organization's study that is on the e-class for more information on that.
Okay, one last big picture question. I'm interested in And some questions were raised about immigration policies globally, because we've certainly seen a tightening down of immigration policies, a tightening down of refugee movement in many countries. And people are wondering if that is going to exacerbate the labor shortages that may be occurring right now in agricultural sectors in Europe and North America, for example, due to people's illness and quarantine requirements and the actual physical logistics of moving foreign labor into helping us harvest and plant our products.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, we immediately saw that with the Canadian case with, 60,000 seasonal workers who move back and forth across the border. This prospect of having a 14-day quarantine period when they entered the country really wasn't feasible for many people, and inconsistent with their employment situations and living situations. Canada loosened those quarantine requirements, but there is and many seasonal workers have come into Canada, but I think every place I think that is a massive open question of how that's going to be handled this year and in the future. If the whole fruit and vegetable sector that the seasonal workers are primarily engaged with, I think is going to be massively changed, both on supply and demand. And I'm really concerned about the knock-on effects of health of those changes. I guess that we will look back in 5 years to say that's been the biggest impact, that there are two things. We've had two huge impacts. One is that we have a fundamental people moving away on demand for the most healthy food, and changes in the supply conditions for that, which get interlinked. The possibility that we really worsen already precarious migration situations. I think that's very, very real possibility, and I think something that governments need to keep paying attention to at the same time as they're dealing with the problems they have within their borders.
And if you look at even the simple production and function approach, we are assuming that we have access to labor, right? We're assuming that labor is there and we can use it as an input in our factory, in the production function of the country. So if we have issues with mobility, that some of this labor comes from abroad, that's something that's directly incorporated into this idea. And then definitely, just like an epidemic was decreasing, taking people out of the labor supply, if we have some regulation that will take some people out of the labor supply, that's a second layer of direct impact on the labor market that we could easily kind of think about, even in this simple framework that I discussed earlier.
Yeah, I'd recommend people, especially for Tim Richards' presentation next Thursday. We'll focus on the horticulture sector with a North American perspective. I think it'll be a great time for people to learn more about this topic.
One more question for Bruno. People recognize the incredible usefulness of the model linkages that you showed, which seems to have been novel for most people. But how do we build uncertainty into that model rather than possibly have it used for policy prescriptive purposes as if it is a deterministic model? Yes.
Yeah, we can make this dynamic system like a stochastic dynamic system, right? And not necessarily, that deterministic rate of contagion. Like when you start with the epidemics and see how that move on to the economy, we can put uncertainty in different parts of the model, right? It just becomes again a more complicated model. And it's possible to capture some uncertainty starting from the epidemics. It's also possible to capture some uncertainty in the production process. Yeah, and I guess it would be an interesting thing to do in times that we are right now, because it's really, we kind of have an assumption that we have a fixed production function, right? We have the same production function going over time, and we know everything that's going on. And the crisis that I'm showing you, they already kind of look deep, but it's kind of almost like a lower bar, because everything we know the channels, right? So if we have uncertainty and things can be even worse, then it can generate a lot more variation. Even we even already have some variation, right? That's my last insight there. When I have too large of an economy, it go up and down as we go through the epidemic. It will become even more interesting. Yeah, definitely more challenging to work the math too.
Brent, just a simple question for you. There's a couple of very related, interesting questions in amongst the questions. People were wondering if this particular pandemic has reacquainted people's interests in the food supply chain to the point where we might actually be demanding more sustainable food production in the future. People were also wondering if things like food safety and food sovereignty will become more prominent post this pandemic, and how can primary agriculture contribute to solving some of these supply chain issues that may have arisen because of the pandemic, or that were not as visible prior to the pandemic, in a way that's going to be productive. Now, I realize the entire rest of the course is going to address many of those questions, but it would be interesting to get your point of view at the beginning about some of those big issues.
Thanks, Ellen. Easy. No. Yeah. Sorry. So I think the answer is yes, kind of yes and yes. So yes, there will be more interest. There's more concern about the security in a kind of strategic sense of our food systems, as well as I think the security of food for disadvantaged populations. And we can see how close to the edge many people are working, and the importance of what are we relying on as alternatives. In Canada, primarily social protection. In other places, more food security programs. So we see the value of those programs. I think the agendas are going to be really interesting, because at the same time as we think there will be a natural response to think of say more local food systems, many of the local food systems that we like are small and medium scale enterprises. And we have a really interesting paper by Getu Hailu in the proceedings document, showing what precarious financial position most of those small and medium scale enterprises are in. So people are going to want to have more of these small and medium sized enterprises as part of the food system. It is a tough environment for them, and other crisis situations have shown, especially the financial crisis, that you actually get a consolidation of agriculture after a shock like this. So I think there will be this natural economic process which is consolidate, and many people would think worsen problems of sort of loss of food sovereignty at the same time as we think we want more of it. So they're going to have to be, I guess, pretty to actually get an outcome out of this, which is a more distributed food system, or perhaps less centralized and less vulnerable to kind of choke points in particular places. It's not going to be easy for those enterprises, and to try to create a business environment for them to be more successful, I think will be a real challenge. So I think it's something for already to raise and to think about what are those business risk management practices for not just for farmers, but also for people involved in other points in the food distribution system that we want to support.
Because of your role in Edmonton food policy, among other things, how important do you think urban agriculture may be in the longer run?
Yeah, so I think, it is a great hope to think of having more urban agriculture, making sure that we don't put blockades in the way of urban agriculture that are on paper and aren't necessary. At the same time, urban agriculture isn't going to be the thing which helps us deal with another shock like this. So what's been most important recently actually has been open borders, right? So we need to think about the dilemmas of an agriculture system which is constrained by weather and space considerations and really profitability conditions that we would like. We'd like a more urban agriculture at the same time as how do we make sure that we be part of a global system which maintains food supplies in situations like this.
Okay, one last question for Bruno. How important do you think it will be that we include our limited or finite resources in a model such as you were describing to illustrate the effects of pandemic?
Well, in a way, in this model captures like finite resources, right? So the way that the model is growing is endogenous. Well, it's modeled in the solo model. So we start with an initial stock of capital, and then after we set up the parameters of the model, the capital accumulation grows forward. So I guess, we could do an exercise of like, how is the model sensitive to initial conditions, right? If I have even lower capital stocks or higher capital stocks as I begin my process of capital accumulation, what happens, and see how that interacts with the epidemic. But perhaps what the question is referring to is this idea of full employment, right? So the idea that if I have a worker, then the worker is going to be used. Okay, so yeah, like one of the things though I should say is that there are many parameters in this model, right? So I can tweak parameters and see if I have more worker productivity or less worker productivity. In a way, this is set up to mimic Canada with a capital share of 30% or 33% and a labor share of 70%. But it's definitely to go from this modeling exercise to what's happening out there now. We definitely need to have a serious model to inform policy. We definitely need a way more complex model and work closer with people from other fields to model this lockdown, for instance, precisely, to model things in a way that can be more informative for policy, right?
Great. I'm going to take the liberty now of injecting a couple of things. A number of people raised questions in the question box about providing a couple of things that I think we will definitely add to the e-class. One is the presenter bios plus email contacts for each one of the presenters will definitely be a document that we will add to the e-class, so that anybody can follow up with an individual presenter about any questions that they specifically have, if they're not addressed in the question and answer box. Somebody also raised a question about whether we could provide a syllabus for the whole program. And I think that we all know that should be provided, but perhaps we just hadn't got around to designing it collectively for the entire certificate program. So we will definitely look into that. So thank you all for those kind of questions. because we can only make things better between now and the next class. I do want to remind you that I certainly didn't address all of the 113 questions in the question and answer box, and we will move that over to e-class associated with this particular module, and many of those questions will be answered. We may group them together when they're similar and answer them at one time, so be sure and have a look at that. I want to remind you again that Brent referred to a number of materials, one of which is a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics that has some very accessible papers on all different aspects of the food industry and how it's been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And those papers are available till July, freely accessible to anybody. I really want to thank our participants for such enthusiastic involvement on chat. They're all saying thank you now as they're starting to exit the program, but also amazing questions, and questions that pertain to our later modules we will try and address directly as we prepare those modules for you. And I want to remind everybody to come back on Thursday for our second module, which will be dealing with food security and insecurity, both in developed and developing countries. And we look forward to meeting with you again at that time. Anybody else on the panel want to say anything before we close out?
I'm good, Ellen. Thank you very much for moderating today. And I guess just one last comment is thanks already to Nargisa, who is our teaching assistant for this, who's been doing a great job, and I think you've been seeing everyone involved is seeing the great work that she's doing. So thanks a lot, Nargisa.
I agree totally.
Just want to also say thank you to everyone and thank you to all the participants. And yeah, it's great to see that level of interest in our course, like many cities, many countries. It's great. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll see you all on Thursday.